Thank you. It's great to be here. Indeed, for the last 2 days, I've had the wonderful experience of connecting Twitter handles and avatars to real faces, which tells you something about how someone who was raised in traditional foreign policy like me is discovering their world changing. So I've spent the last 2 years at the State Department in a job that is kind of the dream foreign policy job for many people in my community. It's the job that George Kennan first held. George Marshall, when he was Secretary of State, asked George Kennan to create the policy planning staff, and they came up with the Marshall Plan. So that's the definition of traditional foreign policy. And if you wanted to go into foreign policy, when I was growing up, that's what you had to do. You had to go into the government. The point of my talk today is to say that if you want to do the kinds of things that I worked on in the State Department, whether that's peace in the Middle East or global health or education issues or cyber issues or any region in the world, you don't have to go into the State Department. You don't have to go into government at all. And what I want to do is to give you a really brief overview of how I think the world of states and societies has changed, how the model of how we think about foreign policy has changed, and then what that means for this community and really for global change. All right. I'm hoping you recognize this. If you don't, I'm really older than I think I am. This is, of course, the iconic vision of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, a physical wall that separated a city, that separated a continent, that was the iconic image of a divide across the entire world. Now, in the first place, just think about that for a minute. We took my kids to Berlin and told them about the wall, and their reaction was, really? You can't be serious that a physical wall could divide a population. Just imagine that today. It just couldn't exist. And even then, of course, television made a big difference for people in East Germany and East Berlin. But fundamentally, division was the starting point of foreign policy in the Cold War. If you think about that, you think about, well, how could that be? Well, we had a vision we imagined we lived in a world of states. Those states were closed, they were opaque. Indeed, the classic image of those states is that they were billiard balls. That comes from an international relations scholar called Arnold Wolfers, who said, imagine the international system like a group of billiard balls bumping into each other, or as you can see from this image, bumping maybe not so randomly, e.g. targeted by bigger powers, one of the superpowers. But that was the image of foreign policy. We had closed, opaque orbs engaging with one another. When you thought about, well, who drove those orbs? Well, the answer was governments. And when you thought about governments, those were relatively small groups of men. And yes, I really do mean men. There are now a few women around these tables. But you still have this notion that foreign policy is driven by a small group of people who are in a government, in a capital, making decisions, in this case, about whether or not the world was going to blow up with nuclear war, or thinking about peace treaties, or thinking about nuclear proliferation, or how to deal with a rival power. So that's the traditional world. It's separation, it's opaque states, these orbs that bump into each other, and it's governments that make the decisions. So now fast forward, 2001 to 2011. Very different world, and we don't start from separation, we start from connection. After the talks we've listened to for the last couple of days, it doesn't really seem to me I need to dwell on this over much, but it's a very, very different starting point for those of us who think about foreign policy. So think about 9/11 and the Arab Spring today. One of the things that they have in common is that they are both powered by deep, wide, dense connections, networks. On the one hand, of course, violent, terrible networks of terrorists. On the other hand, today, very positive networks. We've heard from them of individuals across a region who are determined to stand up for their basic rights. But it still starts from connection, and it starts from an almost infinite number of people who can be connected. That vision of states I was talking about, of billiard balls, they're relatively few. They're under 200 totally, and obviously in terms of great powers, they're more like 20. But if you start from connection, there are many, many, many different entities that could actually be connected. So in this world, let's go to the next. We still have states. We still have China and North Korea and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Egypt. That world of states still exists. But next to it is a world of connected networks. And we call those non-state actors. Now that right there tells you that we haven't made a full shift. Clay Shirky says non-state actors, talking about non-state actors is like calling an automobile a horseless carriage. And that's exactly right? It means that we still assume that the real world of foreign policy is these states, and everybody else, we'll just put them in this broad category called non-state actors that includes everybody from the Pope to Exxon to CARE to many of the organizations we've been hearing about today. Let me just say one more thing about starting from connection. You get many more of these individuals. They're all linked. But there's a very profound psychological difference going on if you start from connection rather than separation. And actually, Mitchell just talked about it in interesting ways. I see this with my students all the time. I talk about the Berlin Wall. I talk about the Cold War and division. They can't imagine being separate as a starting point for who they are. My era was all about the atomized individual who was making choices, or if you were a Marxist, it was the alienated, atomized individual. But the point was there was an agent, and you figured out your interests, and you figured out the strategies to achieve them. That's obviously the basis of economics, but it was the basis of thinking about state interest in foreign policy. Start with separation, then you network with whomever you need to network with to achieve your goals. Starting from connection is radically different. You then have to define who you are in relationship to others, in response to others. How do you respond? What are your values? How do you assert yourself? Mitchell went through what that then means for us. I think this is easier for women to grasp. Women have always been defined more by their relationships. And indeed, I've been thinking about these kind of networks and about being connected ever since I read Carol Gilligan, who talked about how women define themselves or must be defined in terms of a web of relationships. But it is now generational as well as gendered. All right, so going back to foreign policy and thinking about what this means, we now have, instead of states and non-state actors, what we really have are governments, and governments are made of all sorts of different agencies and different parts, and a growing set of social actors, all of whom can be connected to each other in ever-changing ever-changing ways with ever-evolving identities. So what you have here on this slide is the Clinton Global Initiative. Every September in New York, there are two big diplomatic events. One is that traditional world of foreign policy. It's the UN General Assembly. Every head of government shows up. Every foreign minister snarls New York traffic. And they basically have what one European foreign minister calls speed dating for diplomats. They all sit in the UN, and they all go to bilateral meetings. And on the west side, you have the Clinton Global Initiative. And here, you have panels, coalitions of people trying to solve the same problems they are at the UN, But as here, you have the head of a major NGO, you have the head of Goldman Sachs, you have the head of Women for Women International, you have the head of ExxonMobil, you have the ambassador at large for global women's issues at the State Department, and you had the head of the World Bank. That's now what we call a multi-stakeholder coalition. That's the world of governments and social actors. Or at least that's what I thought before I came here yesterday morning. And in the good collaborative consumption, constantly revise what you think spirit of this entire conference, I have now realized this is an intensely top-down and ultimately far less successful version of multi-stakeholder coalitions than all of what you are creating today. All right, given that, I want to come to sort of what are the implications, and I am going to try to work in a number of the examples that I've heard that have really been changing my own thinking as I've sat and listened. So now we're in this world of governments and of social actors, and they can interact in all sorts of different ways. And what we get, and I didn't realize that Stephen Johnson was going to speak before me when I set this up, but it was sort of perfect. What do we get? We get emergence. We get something that is larger than the sum of the parts. Well, it's a collective intelligence. I love the difference between collective and networked intelligence because that's exactly right. But here, this slide is from Christakis and Fowler from Connected, and it just shows you the basic, group of unconnected dots, how you can connect them for different purposes. You get different results. You connect them linearly. You get a bucket brigade. You connect them like a telephone tree. You get very efficient dissemination of information, although as we heard yesterday from Zeynep Tufekci, that also, this particular shape of a network makes it easy for governments to cut parts of that network off. And then finally, you have the kind of small groups that are linked together in a military formation. If you think about a world in which you can connect governments and all these different social actors in all sorts of different ways, then billiard balls can become anything. Billiard balls can become links in transportation networks, any kind of networks. There's no longer some assumption that it's got to be a state. All right. That means we think about power differently, leadership differently, and ultimately what you can do quite differently. Let me start with power. We've heard a lot already about power over versus power with. That's well known to this community. This slide shows you the Y article. It's actually a reference to the X article that George Kennan wrote. But this is an article written by two military officers, a Marine colonel and a Navy captain, who work for Admiral Mike Mullen, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's an article that essentially says the world has moved from a closed system to an open system. In a closed system, power is domination and control. In an open system, power is credible influence. We, the United States, can no longer direct or control anything. The best we can do is hope for credible influence. If we're going to have credible influence, then we actually have to reinvigorate our democracy, rebuild our economy, and live up to our values. And I invite you to read the rest of it. It also recognizes that fundamentally, sorry, wasn't supposed to happen yet? It recognizes fundamentally that for the United States to have credible influence, we have to be the most connected nation. I know in this community, Malcolm Gladwell is generally booed, not supported. But it is Gladwell originally, if you go back to the tipping point, who writes, and he uses the sociology of others, who writes about connectors, who writes about the influence that comes from connectors. But connectors are not just about how many people you're connected to, it's how many different worlds you cross. That's the source of influence, the breadth of your network, but also the quality of your different connections. And we need to think about power in those terms as well, both for individuals and for nations. For leadership, again, we've heard about the power to. You think about power in terms of a hierarchy. You think about leading as getting to the top of that hierarchy and directing. Power with, You're at the center of a web. You think about how you mobilize others to work with you, and ultimately it changes the way you sort of think about bringing people in to be able to accomplish goals together. If you think about power and leadership that way, and you think about a world in which governments and societies interact in ever more complex networks, then you get to what all of us can do to engage in addressing global problems, which is the business of foreign policy. Map, connect, and create. The reason you have the Paris Metro up there is the way I think about this is you go into the Paris Metro and you see these lines and you figure out where you're going to go and you push a button and you see multiple different possible routes to get there. That's the way I think about any foreign policy space, from water to education to against torture to women's empowerment to democratization. The goal is to map the space and connect it in ways that then allow us to mobilize people to address those problems. Give you a couple of examples. I don't have time to actually click on the links, but I just wanted you to be able to see them. The first is actually Airbnb. That's not actually a foreign policy organization, but what I think is so great about it is it's an example of what we heard about yesterday with respect to mesh from Lisa Gantry, that this is a person who just figured out there were lots of spare beds out there, and you could make something by simply linking them together. We heard that about Whipcar as well. Zinch, same thing. Genius idea. Somebody sitting in Beijing figured out you could identify every university that Chinese students could come to in the US and every scholarship they could get. Then you could identify every Chinese university Americans could go to and how to get there. You provide something that is doing more for educational exchange than Fulbright ever will, by sheer numbers. Interaction is a coalition of over 190 US NGOs, again, simply by bringing together what's there, creating all sorts of synergies and a powerful lobbying voice. And the last two are things that we did in the State Department, where we actually collected governments, corporations, NGOs for the alliance, the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, and Partners for a New Beginning in the Muslim World. Again, I thought that was sort of the end of the story until yesterday morning. Listening to everybody this morning, listening to Meetup and Change and Purpose, all the smaller organizations that you are talking about, those organizations linked to their equivalents across localities, cities, states, nations, and globally, that's the real multi-stakeholder coalitions, and ultimately that will be far more important than anything government can catalyze. I am out of time, but let me tell you the bottom line. So we used to live, or we imagined we lived, because all of these are mental maps, but we imagined we lived in a world of closed, opaque orbs. There were states that had national interests that pursued those, bumping into others. Now we live in an open system. This is open system foreign policy of governments and social actors with infinite possibilities of connecting. In that world, social problems are foreign policy problems. Health problems, education problems, problems of governance, of corruption, of abuse of power. Those are foreign policy problems that we as a world have to grapple with. The good news is that by mapping and linking and creating, we can create the coalitions to address them. And it comes down to what Ella Abdel Fattah said yesterday when he described the success of the revolution in Egypt. He said the internet was a platform where we could connect different social groups so we could build a critical mass without having to liberate an entire institution. We built local communities, linked them, and then created a single overarching narrative. We can, in every domain, build local, go global, and change the world. Thank you.